It's amazing sometimes what makes the headlines. I mean, just recently, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, their spokesperson, Guo Jiakun, had to publicly deny a pretty out there rumor. On March 24th, they had to address the story about former Philippine President Duterte. People were saying that he was seeking asylum in China.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, to avoid, potential ICC action. And they said, nope, totally false. Never even came up during his personal trip to Hong Kong.
Really?
Yeah. And, on the surface, it's just a denial, like case closed, right?
Yeah.
But when you look closer, what if this seemingly small blip on the radar is actually telling us a whole lot about the much bigger picture of global politics?
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we're going to dive into today. We're going to really try to unpack this denial and see what it reveals about how the U.S., China, Russia, and the EU are kind of all shifting and rearranging themselves on the world stage. And especially, we're going to focus on how China's actions are impacting the Trump administration's foreign policy strategies.
It's really incredible how something like this, a denial of asylum, can actually give us a unique perspective on how these major global players are interacting and what their priorities really are.
Totally agree. And to fully understand all of this, I think we have to kind of rewind a bit and look at what the Trump administration's original plan was, right? Their approach to foreign policy. And the commentary we've been looking at suggests that they basically wanted to get their relationship with China all squared away before tackling the, the more complicated relationships with Russia and the EU.
Right. So kind of tackle the biggest challenge first and then move on from there. Makes sense, I guess.
Yeah. Seems pretty logical at first glance, right?
Yeah.
But then the commentary goes on to say that this initial plan, this strategy, was totally disrupted. And the interesting thing is that they're not saying it was because the U.S. messed up or miscalculated. They're saying that it was because of China's adherence to principles.
Wow.
So that brings up a really interesting question. What are these principles exactly? And how have they managed to throw a wrench in the Trump administration's plans?
Yeah, that's the key question here. Because it suggests that China wasn't willing to play ball, to engage with the U.S. on the terms that the U.S. was expecting. It challenges that assumption that the U.S. can just set the agenda and everyone else will fall in line.
Exactly. And we can see evidence of this disruption, this pushback from China, if you look at what's been happening with Europe recently. Specifically, all these European leaders, these high-level officials going to China.
Okay.
In just the last few days of March, you had the Portuguese Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, Rangel, visiting. And then you had the French Foreign Minister, Opero, both of them making trips to Beijing and Shanghai. It's a pretty notable amount of diplomatic activity all happening at once, don't you think?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
That's a lot of face-to-face interaction in a very short period of time.
Right. And the commentary connects these visits to a broader sense of, I guess you could say, betrayal within the EU about how the U.S. has been handling the whole Ukraine situation.
Oh, I see.
They're feeling like their interests are being ignored or sacrificed.
Right. They probably feel like they're being left out of the equation.
Exactly. And then you layer on top of that all the anxieties about the Middle East, especially what's going on with Turkey. And it's really no surprise that European nations are starting to look for alternative alliances, trying to find new partners and new perspectives on the global stage.
Yeah, it makes sense that they'd want to diversify their relationships in such a volatile and unpredictable environment.
Absolutely. Now, the commentary does something really interesting here. It brings up a historical parallel, a comparison to Nixon's famous visits to China and the Soviet Union back in 1972. Do you think you could unpack that for us a little bit? How does that historical moment connect to what we're seeing today?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to remember just how pivotal that moment was, those trips in the early 70s. I mean, it was a major turning point in the Cold War. The U.S. was trying to, strategically use their relationship with China as a way to gain leverage over the Soviets.
Okay.
And at the same time, China was using this opening to kind of redefine its role, its place in the post-World War II order that had been, established at Yalta.
Yeah.
So both sides had these very clear objectives.
Okay. So back then, the U.S. was using China as a way to put pressure on the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
But the commentary makes it clear that the situation today is completely flipped.
Right.
What's the key difference that we need to grasp?
Well, the main difference is that now it's the U.S. that's under pressure from China. It's not the other way around. And the commentary goes as far as to say that the pressure the U.S. is facing from China right now is so great and so comprehensive that it actually surpasses what they faced from the Soviets at the height of the Cold War.
Wow.
It's a complete reversal of the power dynamic we saw during Nixon's era.
Really changes the whole game. And it helps explain why China didn't just, dangle the possibility of a Trump visit as a bargaining chip.
Yeah.
They didn't say, oh, hey, we'll consider a Trump visit if you back off on Ukraine.
Yeah.
And it all comes back to those principles we talked about earlier.
Exactly. It goes back to that fundamental principle that China won't make deals that compromise the core interests of other countries.
Right.
They weren't going to leverage a meeting with Trump to gain some kind of advantage on Ukraine.
Okay. So the Trump administration's initial foreign policy strategy, this whole idea of prioritizing China, has been basically upended by China itself.
Yeah.
And because of this, the commentary argues there have been some major negative consequences for the U.S. What are those consequences exactly?
The analysis highlights two main negative outcomes for the U.S.
Yeah, okay.
The first one is that any talks that the U.S. has with Russia are likely to be pointless. In vain, as the commentary puts it, if they don't address the underlying tension and complexity with China first. It's like these two relationships are tangled up now. And you can't make progress on one without addressing the other.
I see.
And the second consequence is the growing distance between the U.S. and the EU. The commentary argues that the Trump administration seems willing to sacrifice European interests, potentially to get some kind of deal with Russia. And this is pushing Europe further and further away and could lead them to look for stronger ties with other partners like China.
So the U.S. might be pushing away some of its closest allies in its pursuit of other goals.
Right. It's a delicate balancing act. And the commentary suggests that they might be tipping the scales in the wrong direction.
Yeah. And now, bringing it back to that initial denial about Duterte that we started with, the commentary describes this as the U.S. trying to play a Korean Peninsula card.
Okay.
What exactly does that mean in this whole context of global maneuvering?
Well, the analysis suggests that the U.S. might have been trying to use this issue, this whole rumor about Duterte, as a way to open up a dialogue with China, like a way to kind of test the waters.
Right.
Start with something less contentious and maybe try to work their way up to more difficult topics like, the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait.
So they were hoping that if China showed a willingness to engage on this smaller issue, it could potentially lead to a meeting between Trump and Chinese leadership.
Exactly. A kind of step-by-step approach to improving the relationship.
Okay. But it seems like China wasn't really buying it.
Yeah, they weren't impressed. China basically saw this as a very small and insignificant gesture. Like the bare minimum.
Yeah.
It fell far short of what China sees as necessary for real progress in the relationship.
Okay.
They're looking for a fundamental change in the U.S.'s approach, not just a willingness to have these, limited and very specific conversations.
Right. It's interesting, too, that North Korea kind of chimed in on all of this.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. The Korean Central News Agency, KCNA, released a very strongly worded statement, an editorial, on March 25th. What was their main message?
Well, their editorial was basically a condemnation of those joint military exercises that the U.S., Japan, and South Korea were holding near Jeju Island.
Right.
They called those exercises extremely provocative and issued a pretty serious warning about taking decisive and overwhelming countermeasures against any perceived threats from, as they put it, hostile forces.
Wow.
Not pulling any punches.
Not at all. It was a very direct and forceful statement.
The commentary interprets this as more than just a reaction to regional military drills. They see it as a direct message aimed at the Trump administration. What's the deeper meaning here?
The analysis suggests that North Korea was sending a signal to the U.S.
Okay.
They were basically saying that they, North Korea, have the ability to escalate tensions on the Korean Peninsula. It's not just the U.S. and South Korea calling the shots. The commentary specifically points to the phrase initiative of accidental firing, which North Korea used in their statement.
Right.
They're basically saying that the U.S. and its allies don't have a monopoly on that initiative. Interesting. And on top of all of this, you had Sergei Lavrov, the Secretary of the Security Council of the Russian Federation, visiting North Korea. What does the commentary say about Russia's involvement in this already complicated web of relationships?
Well, the analysis suggests that Russia's increased engagement with North Korea is partially a result of China's influence. You see, North Korea is trying to, reinforce its alliance commitments with Russia. And they have China as their main strategic partner.
Right.
But Russia also has its own motives here. I mean, they're in the middle of this conflict in Ukraine, and they're negotiating with the U.S. on a whole bunch of issues.
Hmm.
Ukraine, the Middle East, sanctions. And they probably see engaging with North Korea as a way to gain some leverage in these other discussions.
So basically, they're creating instability in one region to put pressure on the U.S. in other areas.
Exactly. They're playing a very strategic game.
And all the while, the EU is watching all of this unfold, and they seem to be moving closer to China. The commentary even suggests that the Trump administration's own policies are kind of pushing them in that direction. How so?
The analysis points to Trump's use of tariffs, that tariff stick, as they call it. You see, the irony is that this economic pressure, which was meant to get concessions from China, is actually driving some of America's traditional allies, like the EU, Japan, South Korea, closer to China. They're looking to strengthen economic and potentially even political ties with China as a way to counterbalance the U.S.
So it's a bit of an unintended consequence.
Yeah, definitely.
The economic actions are having these, pretty significant geopolitical repercussions.
Absolutely. It highlights how interconnected all of these issues are.
Right. So even without directly intervening in a lot of these conflicts, China's position, their relationships, are having a major indirect impact on the Trump administration's goals, both domestically and in terms of foreign policy. Can you talk a little bit more about the nature of this indirect influence?
The commentary really emphasizes that this indirect influence is becoming a major obstacle for the U.S. It's making it much harder to ease tensions with Russia, and it's making it much less likely that Trump will be able to visit China anytime soon.
Right.
So even though China isn't directly involved in the conflict in Ukraine or dictating terms on the Korean Peninsula, their relationship with Russia and their commitment to their principles is creating an environment where the U.S. is really struggling to achieve its foreign policy objectives.
It's like a huge chess game, and every move has all these ripple effects across the whole board. Now, the commentary also takes a quick detour into history, bringing up Nixon and even Kennedy in the context of major shifts in U.S. policy. Why bring those figures into this discussion?
I think those historical references are meant to show us just how big these changes we're witnessing might actually be. For example, Nixon's decision to open relations with China was a direct result of the Vietnam War and how that was changing the global landscape. And then mentioning Kennedy, that alludes to all the debate about why he was assassinated.
Right.
And some people believe that it was because he was planning to pull out of Vietnam, which would have had massive repercussions for the military-industrial complex in the U.S. So by comparing Johnson's more gradual approach to Nixon's much more radical shift, like moving towards financial capitalism, the commentary is trying to give us a historical framework for understanding how major events can lead to profound changes.
So understanding these turning points in history helps us to see the potential significance of what's happening now.
Exactly. It gives us some context.
And speaking of big potential changes, the commentary introduces this pretty provocative idea, the speculation about a Yalta system, V2.0. For listeners who might not be familiar, could you explain what the original Yalta system was?
Yeah, of course.
And what this whole V2.0 idea means?
So the original Yalta Conference was this meeting that happened at the very end of World War II. Between the leaders of the U.S., the U.K., and the Soviet Union. And basically, they decided to divide Europe up into spheres of influence, like who would have control over what. And that agreement, the Yalta Agreement, really shaped global politics for decades.
Wow.
It created the whole post-war order. Now, this idea of a Yalta system V2.0 is a pretty bold prediction. It suggests that maybe the U.S. and Russia have this, maybe an unspoken understanding that they're going to do something similar, divide up European interests again, kind of like a sequel to the original Yalta Agreement.
And that brings us to all this stuff with Greenland and Ukraine, right? So you have Denmark and Greenland criticizing the visit by the U.S. vice president's wife, calling it provocative.
Right.
And then you have Trump saying that, maybe Greenland should become part of the U.S. How does all of that fit into this whole Yalta V2.0 idea?
Well, what the commentary finds really interesting is that Russia didn't really say anything about Trump's comments on Greenland. Like, there was no strong condemnation from Russia. And this lack of opposition is what's fueling this whole Yalta V2.0 speculation. Because it makes people think that maybe if the U.S. took control of Greenland, Russia would see that as a green light, like a justification to take action in Ukraine. It suggests this scenario where both countries are carving out these territories for themselves within Europe, just like what happened with the original Yalta Agreement.
So what could be the consequences of this Yalta system V2.0 for the EU?
Well, the commentary warns that both the U.S. and Europe could suffer some pretty serious consequences if this were to actually happen.
Okay.
They talk about this, this complex transfer of Western capital interests,
Hmm.
and they urge the EU to resist becoming, as they put it, food on the menu in this potential redivision of influence.
So they're saying that the EU needs to stand up for itself. And they
Right.
specifically mention China. What role does China play in all of this?
The commentary emphasizes that the EU needs to work with China to defend the UN Charter,
Right.
especially since their stance on Ukraine is very different from Russia's.
Hmm.
China, they emphasize sovereignty and territorial integrity, which aligns more closely with the EU's position on Ukraine.
Okay. So what's the big weakness of this Yalta system v2.0? If this U.S.-Russia agreement were to happen, where does the commentary think it would fall apart?
The biggest problem, they argue, is Russia's dependence on China. Russia's not the superpower it used to be.
Right.
They really rely on China for economic and political support, especially with all these Western sanctions.
Mm.
And China's been very smart about this. They've actively tried to stop the U.S. from undermining the relationship between Russia and China.
Right.
And they've been working hard to strengthen ties with the EU. So the commentary suggests that China might actually coordinate with the EU,
Mm.
making it much harder for the U.S. and Russia to achieve their goals of dividing Europe.
Okay. So to kind of sum all of this up, this denial, this seemingly insignificant story about a former president seeking asylum, actually gives us a glimpse into an incredibly complex and constantly changing world. It shows just how interconnected everything is.
Yeah, it's a great example of how a small event can reveal these huge geopolitical shifts that are happening beneath the surface.
Right. And the commentary really drives home the point that China's actions, their commitment to their principles, is forcing the U.S. to rethink its entire foreign policy strategy.
Exactly. And it's not just the U.S. Everyone is having to adjust to this new multipolar world where power is more distributed and the old rules don't necessarily apply anymore.
Well, with that in mind, here's a final thought for our listeners to consider. If these major powers, the U.S. and Russia, are potentially working behind the scenes to divide up spheres of influence again, what does that mean for the smaller countries that are caught in the middle? What happens to their sovereignty, their independence? And how will these power dynamics ultimately shape the future of the international order, the system of rules and principles that governs how countries interact with each other?
Yeah, it's a critical question, and it raises a lot of uncertainty about what the future holds.
Maybe taking a closer look at the original Yalta Conference and what happened afterwards, both the good and the bad, could give us some insights into what these potential realignments might mean for the world.
Absolutely. History often provides the best lessons for navigating the present and the future.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.